Hello, all, and welcome to the Meadows Museum and the Louise Martin. Oh, just a second, hold on. There we go. Maybe this is a joke no one gets, but this is how Claire delivers many of her lectures. And anyone who knows her has seen her like this in front of a painting. It's something that I've learned from Claire, and now I can't travel without a loupe and an exam light. So it's cliche, but probably Claire Berry needs no introduction to this group, but I will do so in a personal way. She's the Director of Conservation Emerita from the Kimbell Art Museum, and she had been there until her recent retirement early this year for over 30 years. She set up the lab at the Kimbell, and she made Kimbell's conservation department what it is today. She also, for us here at the Meadows, has cared for our collection for all of that time. She is the primary person who has made sure that the material structures and the supports of our works of art remain in good condition. She's also, of course, a dear friend, and was a dear friend of our late director, Mark Rothko. Most recently, Claire worked on the major acquisition of a portrait of a lady by Bartolomé González y Serrano that was purchased thanks to our advisory council by the museum in Mark's honor. And it was Claire who, as many of you know, cleaned that painting, working on it here in the building. And so we were all intimately involved in that process. It was a personal joy to be able to wander into the studio and see how the painting's cleaning was progressing. And it was one of the last things Mark was able to participate in here at the museum as well. And that's a testament, I believe, to how dearly Mark loved Claire and how happy he was that she would be delivering this lecture series. And on that note, I'd just like to say that she's also a wonderful mentor, advocate for young people in conservation. She's trained many of the important conservators that will represent the next generation. She's been a dear mentor and friend to me. She's helped me in my career. And this is a relationship that many of you know began with the Fernando Gallego exhibition some years ago in 2008. And this was, of course, one of the brilliant ideas of Mark to put together a project that not only looked at artworks from an art historical standpoint, but also from a technical standpoint. And of course, that exhibition is near and dear to both of our hearts because it featured conservation very heavily. And I just like to say this is something that I feel distinguishes the Meadows Museum. And I've had conservators reach out to me from all over the world over the years and really highlight how important it is we feature conservation and conservation science in our exhibitions and in our galleries and in our publications. And this is in large part thanks to Claire. And so I think without further ado, I would normally list the amazing accomplishments that you would see on Claire's CV. But because this lecture is semi-autobiographical, and we're going to see, I think through Claire's eyes, not only the history of paintings conservation, but her coming up and her training at a critical moment in the history of paintings conservation when very specific and interesting controversies were being debated. And in particular, I think for me, how her formation led to her as someone who works closely with art historians and curators. I cannot impress enough how there is still, to some extent, a divide between conservation science and art history as two separate disciplines. In Claire, they came together, and it has been a major part of my formation as a scholar, and I think also had a major impact on the field. So without further ado, Claire Berry.
Thank you, Amanda, for that generous introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be speaking here at the Meadows in this distinguished lecture series. I'm very honored, and I do want to acknowledge, again, Mark Rothko's commitment to conservation, and what a pleasure it was to be able to work with him on so many conservation projects. and I want to dedicate these lectures to his memory. So when Amanda first suggested that I give a series of lectures on the history of conservation, I readily accepted, maybe a little too quickly, because to really present an accurate history of conservation, you have to go back to ancient Greece and work your way forward. And that would be the subject of a very thick book, and maybe even a little bit boring. So I thought, well, maybe I should just give my personal history, how I came up in the field, especially having just retired from the Kimbell. It's given me a chance to reflect on where I started and where I've come. Every conservator has their own personal story about how they became interested in conservation as a field and what motivated them to pursue it. In my case, I was a freshman in college at Oberlin in Ohio. And that year, I think I was drawn to the college for many good reasons, but didn't really know specifically what I was there to study. And the opportunity came up to spend my second semester freshman year abroad in France, where I would be first based in the Loire Valley, perfecting my French and learning about the history of that region, especially all the chateaux. And the semester ended in Paris, where we had lectures in the conservation department at the Louvre. And so I want to say that this was my first experience going to the Louvre. I know I can't impress enough how moving that was. Okay, still not moving. There we go. I'm gonna have to use that. Got it. I'm just showing you a few of that caught my eye. Just the idea that I could be standing in front of a Durer, a Titian, just to name two of so many paintings that impressed me on that first visit. When it came to seeing the Mona Lisa, I found myself in a gallery with scores of people. Obviously, this photo was taken after 1974 because there's so many people holding iPhones, but the experience was largely the same in 1972. The painting was behind glass. It was glazed first of all in the frame, behind a glass barrier, two wooden barriers. Really, I don't know if I could say that I really saw the Mona Lisa so much as I was in the same room as the Mona Lisa. And another photo of two visitors in front of the painting. I do want to mention this wonderful book that was published in 2006, which relates very much to the story I'm about to tell. Mona Lisa Inside the Painting. It has some fantastic technical images of the painting, and the size of the book is exactly the size of the painting. You see the front of the painting on the front of the book, you see the back of the painting on the back of the book, and what this really provides are some of the technical images that I was exposed to on that first visit, which literally changed my life and made me determined to pursue a career in conservation. So I will be relying heavily on these reproductions. I'm sorry I don't have a photograph of Madame Ors, who was then the head of the scientific laboratories at the Louvre in the early 70s when we paid our visit. But there, of all the paintings she could have discussed in the Louvre collection, she discussed the Mona Lisa. And she showed us images that I will be showing you. But I didn't know this field existed within a museum. The idea that there was a team of experts examining the object so directly seemed to me exciting and capable of unlocking so many mysteries and enhancing a much greater awareness of the artist's intentions. Here, I'm showing you images that were photographs from 2004 when the technical images were created for the book that I just showed you. So just to name the people here, and the notes. You're seeing on the left, Vincent Pomerade, the head of the paintings department at the Louvre, and he's inspecting the painting with the head curator of the paintings department, Cécile Salarez. They're examining the reverse of the panel. And on the right, you see Vincent Pomerade sorry, I said the wrong person. No, that's right. And on the right, you see Eric Laval positioning equipment for X-ray fluorescence. This technology was not available in 1974 when I first visited the Louvre. Although I'm departing just for a moment from the Mona Lisa, I did want to show you what a cross-section of a painting looks like, of an old master painting. So these are two cross-sections that were taken by the Da Vinci Virgin and Child with St. Anne, 1503, almost the same date as the Mona Lisa. So, and we'll be returning to the cross-section and what that tells us in a moment. Again, the idea that you could examine directly the front and back of the panel. And here I'm showing you photographs in raking light, and how the surface of whatever the support is of a painting imparts a real texture, and a huge influence on the final image was something that really impressed me. In this case, the Mona Lisa is painted on a poplar panel support, and you see these vertical striations relate to the wood grain, to the rings. And this is an exceptionally large panel for poplar that hasn't been pieced together. And here we return to the cross-section. I was shown an X-radiograph of the Mona Lisa, and an X-radiograph gives you primarily a picture of an artist's use of lead white paint or any material that's very heavy and dense. So we see here not a very clear image of the painting due to the fact that when Leonardo was preparing this panel, he started with a layer of gesso. That would be the first layer applied to the panel, which would create kind of an ivory smooth surface preparation. If any underdrawing were to be done, it would be done directly on that gesso layer. But this was a time when oil painting was just beginning to be used more frequently. And if the artist painted in oil directly on a gesso surface, the gesso would have had the tendency to absorb the oil unevenly. And so for that reason, they introduced a lead white Imprimatura layer next. And it's that lead white first layer of paint that is causing all these cloudy white shapes in the image that we see in front of us of the X-radiograph. And on top of this Imprimatura would be the layers, the paint layers, and then the final varnish layer, as you can see in the cross-section. We also looked at an infrared photograph shown on the right, and I'll show you details of which are more revealing. This revealed some underdrawing that Leonardo used. Typically, infrared is a very good tool for picking up carbon-based materials that become more visible through infrared, especially when they're applied to a white background, gesso ground. You can also see that there's a vertical crack above her head and some old inpainting. Here in the detail, you can see some of Leonardo's preparatory underdrawing of fingers that infrared made available, more visible. And again, here's an image that would not have been available for us to see in 1974, an infrared reflectography image of the entire painting, in which the pigments are really become, all the pigments except for those containing copper or carbon have really become transparent. And not only are we able to see the evidence of the underdrawing that we just saw before, but also pentimenti and a lot of information about the sequence of painting. So if you look on the right, you can see that shawl over Mona Lisa's shoulder was painted on top of the landscape. It's a wonderful tool. And in this detail, you get a closer look. In a painting like the Mona Lisa, which is now covered with layers of discolored varnish, which makes some details in the costume difficult to read, this is a wonderful technique for seeing more detail. And again, very interesting to see the hands through infrared reflectography, which shows the artist changing the position of the fingers in the lower hand. And now I'm going to be going through a series of details of the picture in normal light, which is also an important part of any examination. So starting with the face, I think you can intuit, even from this detail, that there is a film of discolored varnish over the painting. You see a very fine pattern of craquelure, and in fact, when you really scan the painting visually, you see that the type of craquelure varies from one area to another. Some of it has developed as a result of Leonardo's technique. Those cracks we call drying cracks, and they sometimes form when an artist uses a leaner paint over a more medium, rich paint. We'll see some evidence of that. Some of the cracks are due to the expansion and contraction of the panel. I was just thinking this morning on my way over how strange it would be to see the Mona Lisa without any cracks. Would that be disturbing? I think cracks remind us this is an old painting from the early 16th century. Here's a detail of the eye, which really gives us a lot of information about the thinness of Leonardo's sfumato technique, and also the real density of the craquelure pattern over the surface. I'm going to try to point out, in an area like this, you get these kind of quadriangular cracks that relate to the expansion and contraction of the panel. But inside that, you see these more irregular cracks. Those are the drying cracks I referred to from the artist's use of medium. I also want to point out some tiny flake losses here. Basically, the panel is in excellent condition, but it has suffered some losses over the years. When we look at the lips, we can again see this very dense and complex system of cracks, but we also see some tiny paint losses, which I hope you can find yourself, and a very faint tint in the lips. This is a red lake pigment that has faded with time. So we're looking at a painting that has undergone, though in good condition, for a painting of the early 16th century, it has gone through some irreversible changes. And again, a detail of the hands, and I think you can see, even with your naked eye, knowing that there's been a change in the position of the lower fingers. Some of that you can detect with your own eye. And then the landscape, which was very, very finely executed, very thinly painted. Again, a lot of drying cracks in this area, and some of the areas of paint, especially in the foreground where the artist has used some red earth and green earth pigments, I think are reading with greater transparency. And finally, but a very important examination technique is looking at a painting under ultralight fluorescence. So when you see this kind of overall green milky haze, that indicates that the painting is covered with a discolored natural resin varnish. And when you see those dark purple-blue splotches, those are retouches, but those are areas of in-painting that have been added somewhat recently. Older areas of in-painting lose their ability to fluoresce this strongly. And so it takes a little bit more interpretation. But I'll show you a detail to try to make that point. But again, generally, the painting is in wonderful condition for its age. I understand that the last time it received a full cleaning was at the beginning of the 19th century, in 1809. And then in 1952, the sky received a very, very light cleaning. So basically, our experience of this painting is through a 200-year-old discolored varnish. But who would be brave enough to clean it? That's another topic of another talk. Here again, on the left in normal light, we see that change in the fingers, but also I hope you can see there's some kind of cloudy, blanched areas in the fingers. Those are areas of old in-painting that don't show so clearly under ultraviolet light anymore, but they are there. So just to underscore the idea that these images do require interpretation. So I was determined after this experience. I remember walking outside of the Louvre that day on a beautiful spring day and thinking, I know what I want to do now. I want to become a paintings conservator. And as it turned out, Oberlin College, where I would be returning, was a very good place to pursue that interest. First of all, it has a wonderful museum. the Allen Memorial Art Museum. Shown here, the building designed by Cass Gilbert, with some really great paintings, including the Terbruggen, St. Sebastian, tended by Irene on the left, 1625, and the beautiful Turner, View of Venice on the right from 1841. So that, that appetite that had been honed by my experience at the great work of art, some trips to the Cleveland Art Museum, about 45 minutes away. Oberlin had a very strong, still to this day, art history department, and I was especially enamored of my courses taken with Dr. Richard Spear, who taught Baroque art, and he is a specialist in Caravaggio. Just a few years before, he had published the exhibition catalog, Caravaggio and His Followers, for an exhibition at the Cleveland Museum of Art, where I could visit the Crucifixion of St. Andrew on the right. He was also the head of the Allen Memorial Art Museum at that time. And to this day, I consider him a great scholar and mentor. And what I didn't realize before my trip to France was that Oberlin also had a conservation department that acted as a regional center. It was started by Dr. Richard Buck, about whom we'll hear more in a moment. But when I returned to the campus in the early 70s, Mary Jean Butler, shown on the left, an art conservator and microscopist, was heading the regional center and the conservation graduate program that had started there in 1970. It only lasted about 8 years, but many great conservators were trained there, and I made it my business to try to get to know as many of them as I could as an undergraduate. They were very patient with me. Conservators like Anne Honigswald, who spent her career at the National Gallery, Lance and Gay Myers, who became great experts in American art, and others. I can't thank them enough. Mary Jean Butler's work was focused on microscopy. She would take pigment samples and try to identify any pigments in a painting that might be from a later date, from the assumed date of the picture. That led to the cleaning of the painting in front of us, Portrait of a Lady by Franz Hals. On the left, you see the painting before treatment, where there's a cityscape in the background. Through Mary Jean's microscopy, she determined that the cityscape was added at a later date, so it was removed in cleaning, which showed a much simpler architectural background, interior space, and it revealed the arms of the chair in which the woman sits. Mary Jean Butler was very generous to me with her time and gave me a private study to help me pursue my interest in conservation. And I also want to point out that, of course, not only did I need to study art history to prepare to become a conservator, but I also needed to study chemistry. So I was studying general chemistry, organic chemistry, etc., while pursuing art history courses, also taking studio art courses and languages. All of these are the ingredients that you need to try to be accepted into a graduate program. So here I am in 1981 with my class at Cooperstown Graduate Program in Cooperstown, New York. I'm in the center front, and those are my teachers on the left, Sheldon and Caroline Keck. The Kecks founded this program in 1970, and when I look at the photograph of myself and my classmates on the right, there are two thoughts that come to mind. One, I was this little unformed lump of clay. I just think about how much I did not know. Two, there are 5 women and 5 men in my class. And this was something that Caroline Keck insisted on. And she really counted. So her classes were half and half. And as we go through this first lecture, you'll see how few women were in the field, were really active in the field at this point. And the Kecks contributed to training a generation of women. So a little bit about the Kecks. Well, first I'll show you the program. We were set in this bucolic setting. The program was just contained in this small building. It had a beautiful open laboratory, which overlooked Lake Glimmerglass, but we were isolated pretty far from any major museum. Having said that, Cooperstown was the home to 7 different museums at the time. The Carriage and Harness Museum, the Farmers Museum, etc., and obviously the Baseball Hall of Fame. So it was beautiful working there, but also the winters were very, very long and cold, and it would snow in April. It was, you know, it had its challenges, and really working 24/7 with your 9 classmates could be intense at times. We gained a lot of practical experience in Cooperstown. I'm showing you, there was a heavy emphasis on American paintings, many of which came from private collections or historic societies from New York or the Northeast. I'm showing you this one. I didn't treat it, but to me, I looked at it and I thought, in some ways, this was a typical Cooperstown treatment. I mean, literally, a painting might come to us almost wadded in a ball, and we were taught how to relax the canvas, clean the canvas, do the structural work, and present a lined painting at the end. The other reason why I chose this painting to talk about is it was damaged in a fire in what later became my department. And it was restored by another student, Gregory Thomas, who was living in the apartment at the time of the fire. So this was pulled out of the fire, and then it became Gregory's project. But I want to say, too, that we got a great deal of hands-on experience with paintings. Not only hands-on experience with paintings, but with the owners of paintings. We would have a clinic once a week where we as students would have to talk to the owners about a potential project. We would examine it with them under ultraviolet light, etc., and come up with a plan for restoration. And then in the summers, we would have special work study projects, summer internships. And the first summer that I was there, I was dispatched to New York City with a team of 7 other of my classmates to restore a cycle of WPA murals in the Supreme Courthouse at 60 Center Street in New York. Again, reflecting on this experience, when it came to these summer internships, there was a kind of a pull yourself up by the bootstraps quality to them. We were stepping into a little bit of the unknown. In this case, we had scaffolding set up in front of these very large paintings that live in the waiting rooms for the jurors. And jurors were sitting there while we were cleaning. I don't think this would be allowed today. Some of the solvents were a little strong, but the jurors were good sports. I don't remember anyone complaining. You can see on the left that there were 2 cycles of WPA murals. The one on the left by Ryland depicted the early history of New York, and on the right, Pusterla's series depicted contemporary scenes of New York. It was a wonderful experience working with Norman Goodman, who was the head of managed the courthouse and was very committed to this project. But it was very demanding physically, and completing such an ambitious project within the time that we had was also challenging. But I'd like to point out that I absolutely fell in love with Manhattan while I was there. We lived at a corner of 10th Street and 5th Avenue. We would walk down through the village, through Soho to the courthouse, and would spend as much time at the Met as I could. Back to the Kecks, thinking again of myself as this unformed lump of clay. I want to talk a little bit about the Kecks and how little, in a way, I knew about them. First of all, or the field in general, and how recently the field had been formed as a profession in this country. Sheldon Keck was responsible for starting the first graduate program in conservation at the Institute of Fine Arts in New York in 1960. In 1970, together with Caroline, he founded the Cooperstown graduate program. I'm showing you the other shorter-lived program at Oberlin, the dates. And in 1974, the Winter Tour program was founded. All of these in my lifetime, and in fact, you know, within a decade or two of my arrival at Cooperstown. It kind of astonishes me today, especially when I think I've just completed over 30 years at the Kimbell. This kind of puts things in perspective. So A, how recently the field had been formed as a profession, B, how instrumental the Kecks were in doing this. At the top is a little cartoon that an earlier class drew of the Kecks. You see them standing in their lab coats. They were kind of good cop, bad cop personalities. The fact that Caroline Keck used salty language does not even begin to describe her personality. I think you can see it says F blank 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 off children. She called her students children. She called herself Ma Keck. She called Sheldon Pa Keck. Again, I don't even want to think about what an HR department in 2021 would think of any of this. So F off children, we're having a bad day. And Sheldon's response, now, dear, they've probably had a bad day too. It says a lot about their respective personalities. He was the consummate gentleman, Harvard-trained scholar. And this part of the talk, I really want to emphasize how Harvard University was really the birthplace of conservation as a field in this country, and the idea of uniting art and science and introducing science in the preservation of art. So starting with Edward Forbes, who was the director of the Fogg Art Museum from 1909 to 1944, he started the Forbes Historic Pigment Collection. Very, very thorough, and I have in my notes how many samples he has, which I'll find here in a moment. 3,600 cataloged pigment samples, binding media, and historical scientific equipment. He put this together. Some of the early conservators who came out of Harvard, really leaders in the field, George Stout on the left and Rutherford Gettins on the right. George Stout received his master's in art history at Harvard. He was a lecturer and a conservator at the Fogg. From 1933 to 47, he was the head of Fogg's art conservation program. Together with Rutherford Gettins on the right, who had his master's in chemistry from Harvard, they co-authored this landmark publication, Painting Materials, a Short Encyclopedia. Every conservator that I know has this in their library. Very, very important contribution to the field. Other early leaders in the field who really came out of Harvard, I'm showing you Richard Buck on the left, shown with George Stout in 1975. And Richard Buck graduated from Harvard in 1926. In 1937, he joined the Fogg Art Museum as a conservator. He was appointed to the office of conservator at Fogg in 1949, and in 1952, he founded the Inter-Museum Conservation Center at Oberlin College. And Caroline and Sheldon Keck on the right. Sheldon graduated from Harvard in 1932. After completing his master's degree there, he was selected for an apprenticeship in restoration at the Fogg Museum, and then enlisted in the US Army in July 43. Due to his extensive experience with art restoration, as well as his friendship with Paul Sachs, director of the Fogg Art Museum, and member of the Roberts Commission, Sheldon Keck was quickly selected for service with the Monuments Men group in World War II. And Caroline Keck received her bachelor's degree in art history at Vassar, but her master's degree from Harvard, where she met Sheldon. And then she pursued her PhD at the University of Berlin. She married Sheldon Keck in 1933. In this moment, I just want to underscore what I think the importance of World War II as an experience that really shaped a whole generation, not just of paintings conservators, but also curators and museum directors. I don't have the list in front of me, but names that we all know, James Mortimer, et cetera, Paul Sachs, Sheldon Keck, and others, served in World War II, and also even the events leading up to World War II. had a heavy influence on this generation. And with these slides, I want to mention that Caroline Keck was pursuing her PhD on Stefan Lochner at the University of Berlin in the 1930s during Hitler's rise to power. And I want to, if you'll allow me, read from a letter that she wrote me in response to my sending her a copy of Robert Edsel's book on rescuing Da Vinci. You can tell Mr. Edsel, as a graduate student at the University of Berlin, my PhD subject was Stefan Lochner. I saw plenty, far too much for a 23-year-old. I was in the gallery of the Reichstag the day Brüning lost control with a Vassar classmate, Connie Anderson, also a grad student at the university, a French girl and a German girl, very active in this international students group. We ran a soup kitchen in the slums, which fed 110 persons a day with one meal, a potato soup. We collected soup bones from restaurants and scrimmaged for veggies. We insisted on being non-political, so one of us had to be there every day to prevent deadly, capitalized fights. Life was grim, colossal unemployment, starvation wages, bitter corruption. When people are acutely miserable, they snatch at any suggestion of betterment, especially when decked out in visions of national status. The university averaged 15 suicides a month that winter. On and off it was closed. I saw too much cruelty and killings. The worst part, in a way, was that nobody heeded anything I described when I came home. I was, quote, exaggerating, quote, an emotionally disturbed student, etc. Ugh. And I hope all of you are familiar with this great book written by Robert Edsel, Rescuing Da Vinci, and just another nod to Mona Lisa to continue the story. The painting was fortunately not stolen during the war, but it was placed in hiding for 6 years, and the photograph on the right shows its unpacking and return to the Louvre after the war. But I want to highlight the service of some of these monuments men. Again, George Stout, whom I introduced a moment ago, he was the lieutenant commander of the monuments men, and you see at the center, he is helping with the removal of Michelangelo's Bruges Madonna from an Austrian mine prior to transport to the Munich collecting point, and a photograph of the sculpture on the right. And here, showing you a photograph of Captain Walter Hutcheson. He was with the US 9th Army in France and Germany. He did extensive work in the Loire Valley, and especially in the area around Aachen, Germany. He worked together with Lieutenant Sheldon Keck. Sheldon Keck reported to him, and when they were behind enemy lines in the Aachen area in April of 1945, Hutcheson was killed, and his body protected the life of Sheldon Keck, who was pulled out of a foxhole some days later. And again, I'd like to quote to you from a letter from Caroline Keck. The photo of Sheldon, she's referring to the photo on the right, was amusing. He left for service with the armed forces when their son was just 3 weeks old, and returned the day the boy was just short of 3 years old. He and our dear friend, Sam Ratensky, stayed on at the Marburg Collection Center for months after the war in Europe ceased, busy with the complications of returning treasures. Sheldon's early partner, Walter Hutcheson, was one of the 2 MFAA officers killed in action. They mistook the road and drove into the battlefield front when hunting down an altarpiece endangered. The gunfire hit Walter's body, which saved Sheldon, who was pulled out of a foxhole sometime later. And here I just want to show these images of the Meadows' own Murillo, St. Justa, from 1655, which found its way into the studio of Paul Haberstock, a Berlin art dealer, in 1945. He was a member of the Nazi Party who suggested to Hitler and Goebbels the possibility of selling degenerate art at a public auction. eventually, through the efforts of the Monuments men, a system for evaluating stolen works of art became very efficient and refined. And this was eventually returned to its owners. I also want to highlight a very special friendship between Sheldon Keck and Paul Corman, shown here. Paul Corman was an outstanding proponent of art conservation training. He formed the institute in Brussels, the Institut Royal du Patrimoine Artistique, and had a tremendous influence not only on Sheldon, but on the forming of conservation training programs in the United States. He died all too soon. He was also very instrumental in determining that the Van Meegeren paintings were fake. He was trained as a scientist, and he really brought to bear all these different scientific methods of examination to the field of conservation. Also, I'm struck by the fact that, Sheldon Keck, an American, was such a close friend with a man from Brussels. And it, I think, highlights we do really work in a small world, in the world of conservation. And it was a small world then, and though larger, it's still a small world. And I'm also struck by the fact that I was trained by Sheldon Keck, and two of my colleagues over the years at the Kimbell were trained in the institute that Paul Corman founded. Bart de Bolder, who went on to work on the Ghent Altarpiece, who's now head of conservation at the Princeton University Art Gallery, and Peter van der Moortel, my dear colleague, who is now chief curator, chief conservator at the Kimbell Art Museum. Both were trained at this institute. And so this friendship continues all these decades later. Both men made an enormous contribution to conservation training in Europe and America. So after the war, Sheldon and Caroline Keck set up and continued, well, it was set up already in the 30s, but Sheldon Keck continues to expand the conservation program at the Brooklyn Museum, where he works with Caroline, and then Caroline works at the Museum of Modern Art. So they were really developing, really professional programs within museums in the United States. Two prominent museums in New York, and they did a great deal of advising at other museums, such as the Guggenheim, San Francisco, the Phillips Collection, etc. Sheldon Keck also restored Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, so they were working on major, major works of art as well. And during this time, Caroline Keck developed a very special relationship with Georgia O'Keeffe, and she became O'Keeffe's personal art conservator for some 40 years. I think this may be the first instance that I know of where a conservator worked so closely with an artist. And this became a subject of an exhibition, Color and Conservation, organized by the Mississippi Museum of Art, and which they detail this relationship. And from my own personal experience at the Kimbell, when our former trustee, Anne Marion, founded the O'Keeffe Museum in the 1990s, many of these O'Keeffe's paintings came through our studio at the Kimbell, and I was able to see firsthand the results of this collaboration between Caroline Keck and Georgia O'Keeffe, because Georgia O'Keeffe was really, really interested in maintaining a pristine surface. And once you started seeing these paintings, you understood what she was after and how Caroline was able to advise her on that. And she did consciously choose to have her paintings varnished. This is a big question in our field. Did the artist want the painting to be varnished or not varnished? And if varnished, what type of varnish? So this, I think, was the first example I know of this kind of collaboration. So now we're in my second year at Cooperstown, and Mrs. Keck, always outspoken, gave us a lecture on conservation ethics. And then she voiced very freely her opinions about other colleagues working in the field and controversial topics. And in 1974, so this would be the year when I came back from France and resumed my studies at Oberlin, there was a big cleaning controversy that erupted at the National Gallery in Washington when a new acquisition, this Peter Paul Rubens, the Gerbier family, was cleaned. And this set off kind of somewhat of an international scandal where the dealer of the painting and Michael Jaffe, a Rubens scholar, and other conservators such as Mario Modestini were very, very critical of the cleaning in the still kind of young department at the National Gallery. And this ignited a big controversy. The Keck's attitude about cleaning was more objective and kind of advocated for the removal of all foreign substances. It was more scientific, whereas the critics of this cleaning and also of the cleaning of the Rembrandt Mill, which was cleaned at the National Gallery at about the same time, were suggesting a more subjective approach would have been appropriate in these cases because these are old master paintings that have gone through irreversible changes. For example, in the rocky foreground of the Rembrandt, a lot of the subtle glazes had darkened and the shape had lost a lot of its detail and looked dark. The sky too had undergone changes, and if all of the discolored varnishes and foreign matter were removed, the critics of the cleaning argued, you ended up with a painting in which the contrast between the bright sky and the foreground of the landscape was just too strong. Sheldon Keck was one of the experts called in to weigh in on this controversy, and he suggested in a letter to the board of the National Gallery that some of the critics perhaps had a financial interest, so he was still sort of defending the position in a sort of scientific approach. During this class, Caroline Keck said, well, John Greeley, who was then somewhat recently appointed head of conservation at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a very distinguished British conservator, she said, and he was a big critic of cleaning, especially of the Rembrandt Mill. She suggested, well, I thought I might invite him to Cooperstown to speak to students, but I just don't think I could stand to have him stay at my house. So after the class, I went up to Caroline Keck and I said, you know, I think it would be really interesting if you would invite John Greeley to speak. And she dismissed that. Here are two of the critics of the cleaning of the Gerbier family by Rubens and the Rembrandt Mill. So on the left is Mario Modestini. He was a commercial art restorer who worked on very fine paintings and was a proponent of a more subjective approach to cleaning. And on the right, John Greeley, shown with Sir Anthony Blunt. John had a very long and distinguished career in London, working on paintings from the Queen's collection, which Sir Anthony Blunt oversaw, but also very important private houses, Petworth, and so on. Here you see them standing in front of the Mantegna cycle at Hampton Court, which John cleaned, so he was a great expert on Mantegna. So I said to Caroline, I think I would like to apply for an internship, my third-year internship at the Metropolitan Museum. And she let me do it. Maybe she thought it's not going to go anywhere. And I went for an interview and met John Greeley for the first time, completely terrified. And I took every bit of nerve I had to say to him, I would really like to have an internship under your direction. And a week or so later, I got a letter that he was accepting me to this internship. I was just overjoyed at the idea of working with him, someone with his experience, to see what it was like to work with someone with a different approach from the Kecks, and to work in a collection as great as the Metropolitan Museum. The slide on the right shows the Sherman Fairchild Conservation Department, which John had recently fundraised for and opened. I toured that department when I was there for my interview. So I walked into Mrs. Keck's office and I said, I've been accepted to go to the Metropolitan Museum and work with John Greeley. And as feisty as she was, no, it wasn't in her office. I'm sorry, it was in the big open studio. That's important. She yelled across the studio, you will not go to work with that man. So that prompted me to call my grandmother that night. going to the Met. I usually talk to Caroline Keck that way. So I tried a different approach, and I said, my father always told me it was important to read more than one newspaper. And with that, she had my back completely. And from that moment forward, she supported me in everything that I did. And I'm so grateful to her for that. I think Caroline Keck respected strength. And I think she wanted to know that I was really serious. And that was a great story. But she also said, Sheldon will have to go and inspect you on your internship. I won't be able to stand to do it. Because during the third year internship, one of the Kecks would come and inspect your work. So I can say, and maybe this is a good time to wrap up this talk, I was responsible for the one and I think only time when Sheldon Keck met John Greeley while inspecting me on my third year internship at the Metropolitan Museum. The subject of my next lecture will be about John Greeley and the time that I spent at the Met. I will talk about his approach and what that experience meant to me. And then the final 3 lectures, I will discuss case studies on cleaning, structural work, and technical study. And now we'll open up the floor for any questions you might have. How did the Mona Lisa get to the Louvre? I don't know. I'll have to research that. Amanda knows.
And I'm going to be rough on the details, so jump in if anyone else knows. Should I say this in
The question is, how did the Mona Lisa come to the Louvre?
The short answer is that Da Vinci died in France. So he was actually on I think a diplomatic mission to the King of France, and he brought the painting with him. It was very dear to him, we know that. And he passed away in France, and so the painting stayed there. Huh? Well, it was in a chateau. I think it was in the royal palace before it ended up at the Louvre. Yes. So Alan says the correct answer is by wagon, which is very true. Yes. 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 I think many of them were adapted.
And who was in charge of that?
Well, as I say, there were leaders in this. And Harvard University was a leader in France. The Louvre was a leader in Belgium. Paul Corman, trained as a science, was a leader in bringing these scientific methods of examination to bear on works of art. Well, I don't think there's a linear story there. This would be a good subject for another lecture, but they're coming out of the science field and being applied to the study of art. Yes. Carol? That will be discussed in my next lecture. How were the two philosophies of conservation reconciled? And I will be discussing that a great deal in my next lecture when I discuss John Greeley's approach and the experience that I had at the Metropolitan Museum. Yes?
Will you at some point please relate the wonderful story of Mariana?
Oh, yes. We had a wonderful trip. I'm a believer that when a museum is considering the acquisition of a work of art, it is very prudent to not only have a conservator examine it for condition, but also to consult the experts in that field. And so with Linda Custard and Mark Raglan, I traveled to New York to examine the Goya before acquisition with Jonathan Brown. And we had a wonderful experience and very enthusiastic about its purchase. And that's the type of collaboration that I really believe in and have tried to promote in my years of working as a conservator in a museum. So thank you for sharing that wonderful memory. Yes.
Make sure that she was using correct techniques. are modern contemporary artists using different techniques so that conservation will be less needed for their work?
Not necessarily. It really is a very individual thing that depends on the artist, him or herself. So for example, some of the artists, contemporary artists that we most admire, Mark Rothko, Clifford Still, used a red pigment called lithol red that is very, very fugitive to light. For example, there's a series of Mark Rothko murals at Harvard University that faded because of the artist's use of this red. And the way that Harvard has compensated for that fading is to shine a red light on the paintings. It's a really difficult subject. So not all artists are aware of how their materials change over time. It just really depends. There's been a great initiative in the field of conservation, and I believe it was started by Ingelisa Ekman Lane. And it was a project to interview living artists and document what materials they were using. Because it's really our job to understand what is the artist's intent and what were the materials that were used. And so there is a growing body of evidence thanks to these interviews, but it's a very ambitious project and needs to be continually added to and updated to continue to be of great use. Yes?
In the early advent of using technological instruments and so forth, techniques to evaluate, is there a concern about that might cause damage to the picture itself?
Well, these are non-destructive forms of examination, I should point out. Obviously, you wouldn't want to shine an ultraviolet light on a painting for a very long time because that could cause some damage to pigments, fading, etc. But we just don't use the light for a very long time. But the other methods of examination that I discussed, the X-radiography, the X-ray fluorescence, infrared reflectography, these are all non-destructive methods. Now, you could argue that taking tiny cross-sections is actually a destructive method, but that's only done when there's really an urgent question, and these are very microscopic paint samples that are usually lifted from the edge of a loss or the edge of painting. So notice I didn't show any cross-sections from the Mona Lisa because none had been taken, so I showed you one from another Da Vinci, assuming that the layering would be somewhat similar. So that is technically destructive.
There have been in museums before where even if you not use flash photography, they allow regular photography. They objected about automatic focusing, the technique in the camera to determine the distance for focus. I guess they thought that even though, like you say, it's very short, very deep sort of thing, I guess they were concerned
Right.
cause damage.
Thank you. Yes.
Are there any observation studies being offered at universities in our area?
That's a good question.
It would seem to me that the interest in conservation studies here at this museum, we have a art department. There should be something.
Yes, the question was, are there any courses in this area, but I guess particularly at SMU, that deal with the subject of art conservation? And I agree with you that given the stature of your art history department and the stature of this museum, the fact that we live in North Texas, where there are so many great museums and public collections of art, this would be a very appropriate class to offer. Pardon me? It's a perfect marriage. Thank you. We'll talk after class. Yes.
Letting the painting be naturally
Well, I'm sure there are many people who would hold that view. The question is there an argument to be made for just letting a painting age naturally and letting it be? So I believe that if at all possible, we want to see the painting in a state that is as close as possible to what the artist intended without doing any damage. And I also believe, and this is something we'll be talking about much more in the next lecture, I really believe that conservation at its best is a collaboration between the conservator, the art historian, and the scientist. And so this is, and then over the course of treatment, these conversations happen. So it's not just up to the conservator, but gaining knowledge from a specialist, let's say in Goya, or a scientist about questions that arise about the physical state of the object. All of this should inform a conservation treatment.
And we have a question from Zoom.
A Zoom question?
We have a Zoom question. So we have someone who is interested in advice you might have for undergraduate students who are interested in this kind of work, but are unable to pursue graduate studies at this moment. Is there any kind of job that they
So the question is, if you are an undergraduate student with a strong interest in pursuing this type of work, but you're not able to go to graduate school at this point, are there any jobs that I would encourage them to pursue? Any job in a museum would be a wonderful thing to do. I know conservators who started out as museum guards. Any job that you could get in a registrar's department would be wonderful. If you could get a job as an art preparator, that would be wonderful. And there are private companies that handle that as well. So even if you are unable to join a museum, there might be a private company that you could join, and that would give you a great deal of experience on the handling of art, the packing of art. So there are other options to be considered, and I think that would strengthen the students' application to graduate school at a later date. But I do want to emphasize that I think to really proceed in the field now, you will need that graduate degree. And at this point, there are 3 major programs in the United States. The program at NYU, the Institute of Fine Arts. The Cooperstown program has now moved to Buffalo, so the Buffalo program, and then Imprimatura. And obviously, there are other programs in Europe, England, etc., that could be considered, but there are 3 in the United States. Well, thank you all for your attention. You're going to want, yes, one more question. Okay.
I just want you all to know, if you do not know already, I don't believe that anything this museum acquired other artists relationship in the last 10 years at least that Claire contest. He so has so much confidence in her abilities that he always wanted her to really bless something for we acquired. Massive amounts of research and Megan has been doing it for the growth.
Thank you, Linda, for your kind remarks. And I also, well, I'm very flattered, but for my part, I love working with the Meadows collection because it is so good. And what, as my experience as a conservator has taught me, when you work with a great work of art, when you have a great painting in front of you, it continues to give back to you. You continue to learn more about it all the time. And that has been my experience working with this collection. And it was a pleasure to work with Mark. And thank you for mentioning that.
Please join me in thanking.
Thank you.